Welcome, everyone. I'm pleased to open this important launch event for the Task Force on U.S. China Policy's new report, Course Correction Toward an Effective and Sustainable China Policy. My name is David Lane. I'm president of the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands, and it's been an honor for Sunnylands to partner with this esteemed group of scholars on this important project. The Annenberg Sunnylands Trust is a foundation based in California, which was created by Walter and Leonore Annenberg with a mission to advance peace and global cooperation. Most of you who have heard of Sunnylands probably know it as the venue of the historic 2013 Shirt Sleeve Summit meeting between President Obama and President Xi, where they developed the relationship that guided U.S. China relations during President Obama's second term. Since then, Sunnylands has built on that foundation of promoting constructive U.S. China relations by leading a series of high-level retreats, dialogues, and discussions at the Sunnylands estate outside Palm Springs, California, but also in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing. Among the most important partnerships Sunnylands has forged over the years has been with Orville Schell, Susan Shirk, and this task force on U.S. China Policy, which is organized by the Asia Society and the 21st Century China Center at the University of California, San Diego. Comprised of 17 of the leading China scholars in the United States, this task force has made an important impact by providing deep, nonpartisan analysis of trends in U.S.-China relations across a broad spectrum of issues and also making recommendations to policymakers. At this critical moment in the history of U.S.-China relations, we're privileged to hear from several of the task force members as they provide a briefing on the key takeaways of their new report. To begin, I would like to introduce the co-chair of the task force and the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society, Orville Schell. Orville's a former professor and dean of the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. He's authored 15 books, most of them on China, and is a true authority on U.S.-China relations. To Orville's left is the co-chair of the task force, Susan Shirk. She'll be reviewing for us the key points and recommendations of the report. Susan is, as I said, is the chair of the 21st Century China Center at University of California, San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. She previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. She leads the Northeast Asia Cooperation Dialogue and has authored several books on China. Reviewing the important section on trade and investment will be Charlene Barshevsky, a senior international partner at the firm WilmerHale. Previously, Charlene was the U.S. Trade Representative, the nation's chief trade negotiator, as you all know, and was acting deputy USTR before that. She's known as one of the architects of China's historic WTO agreement and will have some interesting perspectives to share on that front. The report section on global governance will be covered by Melanie Hart, a senior fellow and director of China Policy at the Center for American Progress. At the Center for American Progress, Melanie leads efforts to identify new opportunities for bilateral cooperation, particularly on energy, climate change, and cross-border investment. And last but not here, but will be here in just a moment due to traffic and doing double duty for us, is David Shambaugh, who will enlighten us with his analysis of human rights and China's overseas influence. He will also be covering the security chapter of the report. David is the Gaston Ségur Professor of Asian Studies, Political Science, and International Affairs, and Director of the China Policy Program at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He's also a non-resident senior fellow in Foreign Policy Studies in the Foreign Policy Studies Program, Center for East Asian Policy Studies, and the John L. Thornton Center at the Brookings Institution. And David has written or edited more than 30 books and more than 300 articles on China. So please, ladies and gentlemen, as I turn it over to Orville to lead the presentation, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panelists.
Well, thanks, David. It's been really wonderful working with Sunnylands and having such a good partner to sort of convene this public-private enterprise. And it's been wonderful also for me to work with Susan Shirk and the 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego. And thanks to all of you for turning out. We're going to try to be very brief so we can really throw it open to you to questions and discussion. I think, just so that you understand what it is that you're about to hear, this is a group of scholars, journalists, former diplomats who got together 3 years ago, sensing that we were heading into something of an inflection point. And I think that has proved to be indelibly true. The real challenge now is, as we come to the end of this sort of era that we've been living in, where the two countries seem to be getting along well enough, surviving crises, working it out, and engagement seemed to have more or less some purchase on both sides. We seem to be entering into a new, almost gravity-free world where we really don't know what the fundamental principles guiding the relationship are or even should be. So that's why I think our efforts have been particularly illuminating for ourselves to try to clarify our own views and set some of these things down as sort of a basis to start a conversation with people like you. This is a fraught time. It's not a time that evokes tremendous optimism. But I do think that within this sort of the dark penumbra that hangs over the U.S. China relationship, there are some opportunities here if the U.S. can engage in a way which Susan will describe briefly. We're calling it, sort of smart cooperation. Competition. How do you? Forgive me for being sort of too touchy-feely in California and turning competition into cooperation. But that's, you'll hear a little more about that in a minute. I think that if I try to look at the bright side, it is undeniably true that the Trump administration, in all of its clumsiness in many affairs, has gotten the attention of China. And I think China is beginning to understand the basis on which the relationship was limping along was not sustainable. And now the question is, how do we deport ourselves to encourage China and ourselves to reformat in a more constructive way? Can we do that? Maybe not. But it's worth a try. And if America has any pretensions to leadership, that is precisely the challenge. And I think curiously, just being here in Washington yesterday, going around the White House, Congress, other agencies, who could have imagined that we would have had a bipartisan issue? And that bipartisan issue now is a sense that something needs to be done about the U.S.-China relationship. So there is some basis, I think, to have a little hope. Now, I don't want to wander on any longer. With that, let me turn it over to Susan to give you a little more chapter and verse about the report, and then a quick little 3-minute précis from my other colleagues, and we'll throw it open to you.
Thank you, Orwell. Well, this is our second report. It's a little more modest than the first one, which was kind of encyclopedic. We call this a memorandum. The first one was issued in February 2017, just as the Bush administration was coming into office. Trump.
You're forgiven one error, Susan.
And so in this report, we try to look at what has changed in China's own actions as well as our own, and what we should do about it. Beginning with the Chinese actions, the group agrees that Chinese government recent policies and actions are increasingly at odds with the rules-based global order and are highly problematic to the United States and to many other countries. It's not just a matter of China's growing strength or growing international influence, but it's the specific choices that China's leaders have made about how to employ that wealth and power. In particular, 3 areas. In the economy, Chinese government has adopted mercantilist, zero-sum policies that advantage Chinese firms at the expense of international competitors, and they're doing this to build their national strength, including their military strength. And this huge state-funded effort to make China into a high-tech superpower is kind of at the center of that policy. The economic reforms themselves have stalled, and the state's role in the economy grown, so China is no longer converging with global market norms. On foreign policy, I say the most worrisome thing is that the way China has engendered doubts about its peaceful intentions through its assertive efforts in the South China Sea to consolidate its expansive claims of sovereignty, and which, of course, has harmed the legitimate interests of neighboring countries and flouted international law. They also are very much encroaching on Hong Kong autonomy and using pressure tactics on Taiwan. Worldwide efforts to claim discourse power, often by using covert or intrusive methods that involve using overseas Chinese and other foreign groups and trying to get them to endorse Chinese positions on different issues. Domestically, the third area is, normally we would say, well, domestic politics are just up to every country themselves. But in China's case now, domestic politics really have become so authoritarian and repressive under Xi Jinping. And as he has revived personalistic autocratic rule, ended the peaceful turnover of power, the practices at the top, tightened control over information and civil society, and of course the re-education camps for Muslims in Xinjiang, the arrests of rights lawyers, the repression of Christian congregations, all of these evidence of a more repressive China give less confidence in the ability of China's leaders to make judicious and wise decisions, and are also highly offensive to the values of American society. Now, although these negative trends began earlier, and we normally now date this shift from a more reassuring approach to foreign relations to this more assertive approach to 2008, around the time of the global financial crisis. But it's definitely in the Xi administration, he has doubled down on these kind of overreaching policies. So across multiple domains, Xi Jinping is enacting policies that put China's impressive development story of rising in a peaceful international environment, putting it at risk. So it's provoked a large backlash. It's not just the Trump administration, it's not just the United States, it's every advanced industrial country and other countries as well. So then the question we address is, well, what should we do about it? What is the right way to try to protect, defend American interests and values? So what we argue is that we need a course correction, and we need to alter the mix of cooperation and pressure. Even engagement always involves pressure as well as cooperation. But we don't want to spend our time debating the past and was engagement the right policy or not. We want to look toward the future. And we believe that we need to have more pressure, accept more friction in the relationship, We need to publicly call out China for its unfair, ideological, and assertive policies, and we need to push back harder against them. And the Trump administration has definitely got that part right. And as Orville said, he's gotten the attention of Beijing. But our report argues strongly that pushback alone isn't actually a strategy that will succeed in getting China's decision makers to make the specific changes we seek. So instead, we propose this concept of smart competition, building on American strengths to compete more effectively with China. Yes, it needs to be tougher, but it also needs to be smarter, effective, and sustainable. So smart competition builds international coalitions of allies and friends to press China's leaders to follow international laws and norms. What it doesn't do is try to go it alone and alienate our friends and allies. What smart competition does do is preserve and update international institutions and agreements that augment our influence on China's choices. But what it doesn't do is to try to go it alone and weaken those international structures. So smart competition also involves trying to negotiate priority disputes with Beijing by laying out concrete measures that China could take to to get more in line, respect for our interests and improve relations. So what we need is a clear set of achievable demands. And we need to communicate those clearly to China. So rather than just competing for the sake of competing or grandstanding or pushing back for the sake of pushing back. So sensible negotiations with clear demands are essential to test the flexibility of the Chinese leadership to modify their policies in line to reduce the international costs that they're now experiencing because of the backlash. So what we wonder is this pragmatic gene, the gene that we saw with Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and even Hu Jintao for a while, is it still alive in China? Is Xi Jinping motivated and able to modify his policies in order to reduce the costs that China is bearing? Now, this is a really interesting question that we debate within our group. Are these kind of overreaching policies, statist, mercantilist policies, assertive foreign policies, are they hard-baked into China's Leninist Communist Party rule, or are China's leaders still able to make changes in a practical, pragmatic manner to reduce their own costs? So we believe the only way to find out the answer to that, of course we've been trying to negotiate with China for a long time. Many people are frustrated and kind of given up. I think it's fair to say our group has not given up, and we believe that we should make a good faith effort to negotiate, and then we find out information about the flexibility of the Chinese side, and we can update our strategy. We also think it's important that we leave the door open for cooperation on important global issues. We also, as China hands, want to emphasize that China is not monolithic. There's a lot more diversity, a lot more change always happening in China than people from the outside generally realize. So the internal economic and political situation is unlikely to be a straight line from the present. It's changed unpredictably in the past, and that's likely to happen again. So we don't want to unnecessarily lock ourselves into a position of outright hostility to China, declare China the enemy, in a way that would preclude future adjustments and cooperating with China in the future. And also because there is quite a diversity of political views inside China, including liberals, we need, who are now quiescent because they're forced to be, but we think it's really important to continue advocating for our own liberal democratic values, which support and resonate with these folks in China. Finally, just a few cautions that we flag for our strategy toward China. Our critical challenge is to right-size the China threat, not exaggerate it, not inflate it, but understand it, and to pursue solutions that can address it without undercutting the vitality of the American system or our alliance structure and economic well-being. So what does that mean? That means we have to strike a balance between protecting national security and preserving our own open society. We shouldn't overreact to the perceived China threat with over-expansive sense of all the technologies that must be protected. We should think long and hard about the costs of restrictions on Chinese investment, on Chinese students coming here, on export controls, that could be very self-defeating from the standpoint of America's own innovativeness, its own innovation ecosystem, and could also trigger an anti-Chinese version of a Red Scare that casts a shadow of suspicion over people of Chinese heritage and others with close ties to China. So yes, we need to protect our national security, but let's give careful thought to exactly how to do that and what technologies are essential to our national security and which other technologies we can leave open in order to make progress working together. And that includes the concern about decoupling. You know, these restrictions on trade and investment, we believe, should be highly selective. It would be very disruptive to really try to disentangle our highly integrated economies. It will disrupt production chains. It'll be highly inefficient. And it could really disrupt, I mean, we could be in an era of deglobalization. If you think about it, U.S. China relationship is really at the core of this period, this wonderful period we've had of global economic and technological integration. And if we really tried to decouple our economies, it would put tremendous pressure on our friends and allies who are trading partners with China as well as the United States. I mean, what are they going to do? And I don't think we should assume that they're always going to choose the United States. So finally, we say that, you know, our best defense is to be a better version of our democratic selves instead of trying to become more controlling, more exclusionary, more like China. So let's not get into a race to the bottom with China. Let's strengthen ourselves as best we can, and we hope that our report will stimulate a good debate about these issues in which the national security needs and the economic dynamism will be thought through very clearly and will make a very reasoned choice instead of rushing off a cliff in a way that could be very harmful to ourselves. And now the economic section, I really commend to you. If you read nothing else in the report, please do read the economic section, which I think is extremely informative about the complexities of Chinese policy and how we should respond to it. Charlene.
Susan, before Charlene, I want to acclaim you for your very good presentation, but I want to admonish my other three colleagues that this is a press conference, and we want your questions, so you're going to have to trim your jibs a bit here.
Okay.
Thank you. I will. There have been 4 dramatic changes, I think, in the U.S. China economic relationship. Some of these were highlighted in our 2017 report, but some are newer, and I'll just take you through the 4. First of all, the economic underpinning of the relationship has changed. Previously, China, as you know, exported labor-intensive products that were simpler, if you will. They imported more sophisticated technology and capital-intensive goods from the U.S. and the world. That model has changed, and we find ourselves in significant competition with China, including in advanced sectors, particularly high-tech. If you think about the current trade dispute, this is a tech dispute. That really is what this is. Second of all, since roughly 2006, 2007, under the Hu Jintao administration, China rolled out a series of ever more comprehensive industrial policies with the stated aim of promoting indigenous innovation in China, promoting import substitution, and increasing Chinese firms' control over what are viewed as core technologies, boosting the domestic market share of those companies, boosting the global market share of those companies in a way violative of the international rules to which China had agreed in the WTO and other arrangements. The nature and the scale of the industrial policies is almost unfathomable. If you look at just one tech sector, that is microchips, the estimates are that China will subsidize the creation of a much more sophisticated sector than they have now, to the tune of somewhere between $170 billion in subsidies to $240 billion in subsidies. But there are 15 other tech sectors. So the nature, the scale of the state intervention is quite extraordinary, unprecedented. And second of all, apart from scale, China has imposed an array of policy instruments designed to favor domestic firms, designed to discriminate against foreign firms. I think you're all aware of these, including forced technology transfer, heavy subsidization, the recreation of state champions, so on and so forth. They've been outlined repeatedly in the press and by the administration. Third, as Susan mentioned, in the lead up to WTO accession and following WTO accession, China was on a convergent course toward market-based economic norms. And beginning in 06, 07, you saw that convergent strategy and model beginning to diverge. Under Xi Jinping, of course, that divergence has been accelerated, and what you see is a reimposition of a statist model in China. Reform and opening, which began to sputter in 2006, 2007, then stalled, and until very, very recently has been entirely absent from the Chinese policy agenda. And last, of course, the U.S. and China are both openly strategic rivals. U.S. made that declaration formally in 2017. It had been the case for a while. And for China, the U.S. has always been the bogey, right? It has been the marker against which China had to proceed, and that's been going on for probably a decade. So Chinese companies are much more competitive in strategic sectors. At the same time, China's economic model is divergent from market-based norms heavily dependent on state intervention, state control, state direction, and this really has led to the impasse that we see today. We made a number of recommendations in our 2017 report. I won't reprise those here, but instead just make a comment about the administration's China policy. I think some of the things the administration has done are a continuation of what had gone on before, including engagement, which of course still continues. There's more teeth to it, but the basic steps, that is to say, supporting more law enforcement against cybercrime, engaging in high-level negotiations, strengthening our investment review laws, so on and so forth. These are not new initiatives per se, but they are more aggressively applied than they had been in the past. The larger issue are administration missteps, which have cost us quite dearly if, in fact, the focus of administration policy is on China. So it isn't merely the mixed signals coming out of the administration as to what it wants and what the president wants, but the focus on bilateral trade deficits, when the focus should be on market access, on fair and reciprocal trade, not on the volume of purchases American consumers make. That's not the right focus, and it has relatively little to do with unfair trade practices. The focus is and should be market access and structural change in the Chinese economy, not one-off purchases of goods China is going to buy in any event. Second largest blunder is withdrawal from TPP. This was such a dreadful mistake for the United States. TPP was the high-quality agreement in Asia, which addressed most of the practices about which the administration is complaining, and was formulated in the way it was to, in fact, address China's practices were China to ever wish to accede to the TPP. And if it didn't accede to the TPP, China would be disadvantaged economically in the region. This, the United States walked away from instead of fixing the areas it might have been concerned about. So it walked away from further anchoring the United States in Asia, the fastest growing region in the world. We walked away from increasing the tie between the United States and our alliances in Asia, and we walked into a gift to China at the same time. So this was a remarkable blunder. To some extent, I believe the administration sees it. If you look at the new NAFTA, many of the provisions are drawn from TPP. All the modernization stuff in NAFTA is essentially drawn from TPP. And of course, big blunder when you alienate allies, when you insult them, diplomatic rifts that are unnecessary, including imposing tariffs for bogus national security reasons on our allies, and indeed on China in the case of steel, aluminum, and potentially autos, which would be really completely unbelievable. So these missteps raise the concern that the U.S. actually wants to decouple from China rather than fix what needs to be fixed. Susan already went through our views on this issue of potential decoupling. The new report recommends a course correction, continue negotiations, but on structural issues most especially. Second of all, work with the allies and partners. It creates leverage. China is not interested in being isolated from its major trading partners. Third, rejoin TPP. Rejoin TPP, which is now called CPTPP. Rejoin it, and then take the agreement to Europe. And then you've got 60% of global GDP. You have, in effect, rewritten WTO rules, revitalizing that institution at the same time. Fourth, recognize that the WTO is a powerful tool for change with respect to China. There are China-specific provisions in its accession agreement prohibiting forced technology transfer, on which this administration and the Obama administration never sued, remarkably. Provisions on the conduct of state enterprises in the marketplace, other provisions in the services sector that have never been used as a basis for claims. They should be used. Use the WTO for a much broader case against China's statist practices and policies called nullification and impairment, meaning China, your trading partners, didn't get the benefit of the bargain when we let you in the WTO. You're supposed to have opened your market. You're closing your market to fair competition. That means you have nullified and impaired the benefits of accession to your trading partners and either leave the WTO or fundamentally change your practices. The U.S. should resume the negotiation of the bilateral investment treaty. I think, in effect, the administration is doing that in the current round of negotiations, not calling it a bilateral investment treaty, to be sure, but dealing with almost all of the same issues that the BIT had made progress on with respect to technology, market access, fair treatment of U.S. investments, so on and so forth. Continued focus on cyber espionage and legal remedies against cyber espionage, and there ought to be legal remedies against the import of products into the U.S. from China that benefited from cyber espionage or that benefited from IP theft. There's no reason those products should be coming into the United States in carefree manner. And last, and the most important thing, is that the United States has to strengthen itself, regardless what China does, because we can't control what China does, but we can control what our economy looks like, what the nature of our competitiveness is, the nature of education, so on and so forth. We can control how strong our alliance structure is. These are things we must do regardless what China does, or we will weaken ourselves, and not just against China, but with respect to our role in the world today. And that is simply a self-inflicted wound. I'll stop there.
Melanie.
I can say a few words on the global governance dimension of U.S. China relations. That has always been the bright light, because on issues like climate change, on Iranian nuclear nonproliferation, we've been able to find common interest. Unfortunately, one shift is that the downside of China's global contributions are increasingly outweighing the positive side. Last year, Xi Jinping declared that China will lead the reform of the global governance system. Unfortunately, he's also stated that one of the goals is to push back against universal values like freedom, democracy, and human rights. President Xi has personally called those values dog meat masquerading as lamb. He describes the U.S. effort to push universal values as a trick to convince Chinese people to fight against the regime from the inside. And so we have to keep that motivation in mind when we look at China's pattern of actions around the world. There have been some concerning issues with trying to water down human rights regimes, a lot of action on the digital internet, trying to push against a free and open internet concept. And with the Belt and Road as well, we've seen a pattern of concern. The Wall Street Journal did an amazing piece sharing some of the details from the internal negotiations with the 1MDB project in Malaysia, which demonstrated that from China's perspective, that was all about getting a naval base in Malaysia and falsely selling the projects there as a benefit for the local population. So a lot of the empirical pattern of China's global activities is particularly recently of concern. Unfortunately, the United States is leaning back and providing maximum maneuvering room for those problem issues. The Trump administration has pulled the United States out of the Iran deal. The UN Human Rights Council, TPP, has announced its intent to pull out of the Paris Agreement. And it's important to note that Xi Jinping made his statement saying that China is going to be the global governance leader right after Trump made the Iran announcement and Nikki Haley made the UN Human Rights Convention announcement. So the United States really should use this as a learning experience and recognize that when we are not there pushing and supporting liberal democratic principles in the global governance system, China has an alternative, and they will take that space to push the China model. And we flag the digital infrastructure space as a specific area of risk in this report. Digital infrastructure is the infrastructure of the 21st century, and there is, again, an empirical record of China using overseas financing to support other nations to build their backbone networks, fiber optic networks, using Chinese technologies. The technologies themselves bring some risks for potential uptick in suppression and repression because they're using facial recognition technology and other systems that help repressive regimes control their citizens. Unfortunately, we now see that regulatory practices are going bundled with the technologies. So in nations like Tanzania and Zimbabwe, first they built Chinese component digital infrastructure, and then they rolled out Chinese-style regulatory reforms that restricted the way their citizens could use that infrastructure. And we should watch very carefully for those countries also beginning to support Chinese initiatives at the global level to define the global internet as one that is balkanized based on internet sovereignty, where each nation has the right to restrict freedom within their own borders, versus the U.S. version of one that is free and open. And so basically, when we look at what has happened since the United States has stepped back from the multilateral arena and China has stepped forward, we see that there's a pattern of concern across multiple areas, and that calls for the United States to step back in. Particularly, we call for the U.S. to put concrete alternatives on the table in the digital space. We can't just preach at developing nations and say you shouldn't do the China model if there isn't a U.S. Western alternative. The Trump administration is actually doing a pretty good job at focusing on developing aid and talking about clear choice initiatives. They're doing some initial transparency initiatives. We need to make sure a good chunk of that money and financing is dedicated to digital infrastructure specifically. I'll turn it over to David.
Okay. Well, I'm going to sort of wear two hats here, a hard power hat and a soft power hat, you might say, because we have two other sections in the report. Actually, we have three other sections, if you include human rights, which I guess Orville will speak to. But I've been asked to summarize the sections on security and on influence activities in the United States. So as I say, the first one, of course, will be rather more hard power oriented, the second one more soft power oriented. I want to say first, though, if I can, it's just been a professional and personal pleasure to be part of this task force over the last 2 years, and I want to thank our co-conveners for that. I think this kind of exercise is one of the things that makes America great. I'm not going to say again, but seriously, the kind of interaction between the non-governmental community putting together and putting out reports like this that hopefully will have some impact, not just on the government, but on public discourse and public thinking is really, I think, one of the strengths of our system. So, and it's been a pleasure to be part of it. International relations is always evolving, hence American foreign policy has to evolve with it. Our relationship with China is evolving, hence it also must evolve. And I think this report, as Susan indicated, is an attempt to map out a sensible and responsible pathway forward for our continued interactions with, I'm not going to use the word engagement with, but interactions with the other major power on the planet. Okay, so if you read the report, you'll notice parallel structure in all the sections, sort of what has changed and essentially what to do about it. So I'm going to organize my summaries of these two sections along in those two categories. But if you read the security section, you'll see, I think at the outset, discussion of what hasn't changed in China's military modernization. It's been a very steady process, really dating back to 1989, but the report argues really intensified in the 1990s. Chinese defense spending has been growing at, I think, 11.5% per annum in an inflation-free environment, really over 20 years. And those increased resources, which I think are now about $160 billion US a year in the official budget, is second in the world, and it is buying all kinds of things, both hardware and personnel, and so what we in the security world call software issues. So steady military modernization. Two other things that haven't changed: increasing what's known in international relations as a security dilemma, sort of an action-reaction dynamic between two countries that is leads to potentially arms races, actually. We're not yet, I don't think it's fair to say, in a complete arms race with China. They may be with us, however, but nonetheless, both militaries and military-industrial establishments are fielding and funding weapons systems and training very much with the other in mind. So that is a security dilemma dynamic. That hasn't changed, it's just intensified. The third thing that's intensified is the security competition between the United States and China, certainly throughout the Asia-Pacific region, but now increasingly into the Indo-Pacific, Indian Ocean, littoral region, and even beyond into other parts of the world. So those are what you might call hardy perennials, but they have intensified under the Xi Jinping period. So what has changed in the security domain, the security section argues? Well, quickly, several things. Xi Jinping undertook in January 2016 the most extensive reorganization of the People's Liberation Army ever since 1949. Completely redrew the wiring diagram, the organization chart of how the PLA and China's military is organized, essentially away from a Soviet model to an American model that emphasizes jointness, US-style theater war zones, and an increased expeditionary force for missions of the PLA. To become expeditionary force is kind of code word in military circles for global deployments. So this follows on to Hu Jintao's actually started that, but as to say, China moving beyond Taiwan, moving beyond the first island chain, moving beyond the Western Pacific to truly go global in its military aspirations, mission, and weapon systems. Let's see, all elements of the People's Liberation Army, which is a comprehensive term that subsumes all services, have benefited from this, but most particularly the Navy. China's Navy, surface Navy, now has more ships than the American Navy. I believe about 320 to 280. Its submarine force has dramatically expanded, both conventional and nuclear. Its missiles, a variety of missiles, not just ballistic, but cruise missiles, have their arsenals in those spheres dramatically expanded. Asymmetric, cyber in particular, but other asymmetric capabilities dramatically expanded. China is now fielding fifth-generation attack aircraft and is working on a sixth, in fact. Maritime Coast Guard and militia dramatically expanded alongside the Navy itself. So across the board, many new weapons have entered the inventory of the PLA just in the last 5 years, and it surprised a number of security specialists and longtime PLA watchers. What else has changed? China's ability to deny, or what's called A2AD in Pentagon speak, area denial, for other forces, i.e. American forces, within the first island chain. That capacity of China's ability to make life very complicated, if not deter altogether, activities by other militaries, including China's neighbors, increasingly difficult. What else has changed? South China Sea, of course. 7 features are, as you know, being built from underwater to above water. 3 of those 7 now show aspects of military infrastructure. There haven't been deployments yet, but the ports, the runways, everything is ready for deployments on at least 3 of the 7. That will give China serious power projection into the South China Sea, towards the Malacca Strait, and into the Indian Ocean, if and when they take place. The last thing that has changed is the increased potential for accidents between the two militaries. This is really dangerous because there are no conflict de-escalation mechanisms or crisis mechanisms in place. There are some so-called hotlines, but they're not even answered when they are picked up. This was a real feature of the Cold War, but with the Soviet Union, we had such mechanisms in place in case accidents at sea or in the air took place. We do not have that with the People's Liberation Army, and that is a urgent need, I would say. This section argues the other things that have changed: Taiwan, increased mainland frustration about Taiwan, increased mainland economic pressures on Taiwan, And I would add, I don't think the section talks about it, increased moves by the Congress and the Trump administration to push the envelope with respect to the One China policy through the Taiwan Travel Act specifically. So that's a new element that we, the U.S., have introduced into the mix. A couple of other new things that the report notes in the hard power category, nervous neighbors. As China's capabilities have built out and its new assertiveness under Xi Jinping has become more apparent, obviously the neighbors and the neighborhood have become a lot more nervous. The neighbors' ambivalence is, in many cases, turning to real alarm and concern. So there's a qualitative change. I can tell you in Southeast Asia, where I've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years, that is very much the case, but you also see it elsewhere. And finally, the report notes what's known as the securitization of economics. So a lot of what Charlene was beginning to go into with innovation sort of issues, AI and others, the national security dimensions of the U.S. China economic relationship now falls not just in the economic basket, but increasingly in the national security basket. And in this city, we're obviously revising rules for inbound direct investment in the United States, American national security innovation base, and so on. So that's what's changed. The report argues what should we do about it? Well, it argues three things quickly, and I'll try and be really fast about all this. American military modernization has to keep pace with Chinese military modernization. Modernize U.S. forces in the Western Pacific. I'll leave it to you to read the report. There are a number of examples that the authors of this section note needs to be done. The U.S. needs to increase its interoperability with its allies and partners in the region. So it's not just a U.S. going it alone. We need to network-centric warfare is the terminology, to network American capabilities in the Western Pacific and into the Indo-Pacific. Third, the U.S. needs to improve its defenses for forward-deployed U.S. forces and bases, right? China's ballistic missiles in particular, but also cruise missiles can, the old AT&T ad used to say, reach out and touch someone. Their range can hit and destroy stationary targets and mobile targets like aircraft carriers. So the report argues we've got to really work on improving our defenses as well. Air bases, ships at sea, harbors, electronic warfare, and so on. And then the report argues that the U.S. needs to engage in what's known as active denial to prevent China or any other country, I can't think of any other country, but that would try and take an initiative and seize a territory, shall we say, within the first island chain, shall we say. So the U.S. has to be ready, and that leads me to the next point, to uphold our legal commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act with regard to Taiwan's self-defense. I underline the word self-defense, which is how the act reads, and to uphold the One China Policy. So the report emphasizes that. And then the last two things the section on security emphasizes, it has to do with the maritime domain, East and South China Sea, to do several things, to improve other countries, Southeast Asian in particular, countries' maritime capabilities and awareness in that area. So strengthen the other partners and allies, namely Philippines and Thailand. Have a credible keep credible, I should say, the U.S. commitment to help Japan defend the Senkakus, which the Obama administration has interpreted the U.S.-Japan Mutual Security Treaty as applying to. Japan administers the Senkakus, therefore under the MST, the U.S. has responsibility to uphold that. Carefully monitor the building of these islands into bases in the South China Sea, uphold the Hague ruling on the South China Sea, and insist on freedom of navigation in international waters and continue freedom of navigation operations. And lastly, the section on hard security argues that in terms of the national economics of national security, that the U.S. really needs to work on its national security innovation base and to refurbish the FDI screening mechanisms for inbound Chinese and other investment into the United States that bumps up against those sectors. So in general, if I could, that's sort of a summary of the security section. If I could try and do it more briefly on the influence section, which I had more of a hand in writing. So shift from hard to soft here. So this is a new issue. Our report 2 years ago didn't have any mention of the issue of influence activities. It was a non-recognized issue. I'm not going to say it wasn't taking place, but it has really come on the agenda over the last 2 years on a global basis. That's the first thing to note. This is not just an American experience, but it is truly worldwide. We all know about the cases of Australia and New Zealand, but I would also point to Central European, West European countries, Latin American countries, and Asian countries. So this is a global phenomenon. Americans are not very well acquainted with this. We're much more acquainted with the hard power and the economic power and the diplomatic dimensions of U.S.-China relationships. So this is a new issue in which we need to, first of all, educate the American public and American officials at all levels, state and municipal included. I would note, not just in passing, that the Hoover Institution report on influence activities, which was a working group of this task force, has produced a very lengthy study on this subject. If you haven't seen, I would commend it to you. So what is this all about? Very briefly, Chinese influence activities. The primary motivation on Beijing's part is to promote sympathetic views of its government, its policies, its society, its culture worldwide, and to shape, if not control, the international narrative about China. So it is really it's in the information space. That's what overwhelmingly distinguishes it from, say, Russian influence activities. They are involved in many more subversive efforts to subvert American democratic institutions, alliances, and so on. China is working in the information space to try and shape how others see, write about, speak about, think about China. This is not new. It goes back, I dare say, to 1949, if not before. And the Hoover report has lengthy discussion about how the institutions of the Chinese Communist Party, such as the United Front Work Department, the Propaganda Department, the International Department, the State Council Information Office, National People's Congress, Chinese People's Political Consultative Congress, People's Liberation Army, Xinhua News Agency, and so on, have been involved in these influence activities for a very, very long time, decades. In fact, it goes back to Yan'an and Edgar Snow's time in Yan'an. So this is not new. It's sort of been recognized recently. So that's really what distinguishes it. As I say, it's involved in the information space to control the narrative. If you read Chinese writings about this issue, they argue that China's engaged in what they call a huayujian, a discourse war with the West, with the Western media, what they call the Métis Bachyan media hegemony. So they are fighting back. They see themselves as in a reactive position, that the Western media have dominated the global discourse on various issues, including about China for the post-World War II era. China needs to increase its own voice, as Xi Jinping puts it, to tell China's story well, so China sees itself in a kind of reactive way. And it is doing a lot of things. Our Hoover report and this report emphasize most of these things are actually quite legitimate. They fall in the realm of traditional public diplomacy and lobbying and cultural and educational exchanges and media exchanges. They are no different from what the United States government and other governments do, okay? They bring foreign visitors to China. They try and influence international opinion. All powers do that. So China is no different there. But what we do distinguish in both reports is the distinction between influence and interference. So interference activities go beyond information exchange, and they involve censorship and punishment to silence critical voices. Now, American companies have long been reticent to criticize China for fear of commercial retribution, but now U.S. universities, think tanks, NGOs, and other actors are also learning that China will punish them too by suspending or breaking off exchanges if they sponsor events or issue publications that the Chinese government deems offensive. So that is interference. That's an example of interference. Many of China's influence activities, going back to influence, are aimed at elites, not at the mass public. They're trying to shape the views of China specialists and opinion writers, journalists, foreign policy experts. So what to do about all this? There are other examples in the report about interference. It includes peer monitoring of Chinese students, of other Chinese students on American campuses. It involves Communist Party cells on American campuses. It involves Chinese student associations who have very close linkages to Chinese consulates and embassies. It involves a lot of stuff that I don't have time to go into, but the report, particularly the Hoover report, but also the section in this report details, and I can only refer you to that. So what is to be done? Well, we argue in this report 3 things. Transparency, actually 4 things. Transparency is of the utmost. Secondly, education is of the utmost. We have to educate our actors in this country, our civil society actors, our universities, our think tanks, our governors, our mayors, our congresspeople, about the nature of this challenge and this issue. Thirdly, due diligence and oversight must be exercised by our institutions. Influence peddling is nothing new to the United States, ladies and gentlemen. It's been going on for a very long time. We have something called K Street down here, right? And the Congress, is constantly lobbied. The executive branch is lobbied. So this is not new, and therefore we have in place laws and mechanisms to shield ourselves and to resist such illicit and malign attempts. In universities, I can tell you, we have faculty oversight mechanisms. If gifts are given to institutions, they should be vetted. So we're calling, in fact, for a strengthening of existing mechanisms. And then lastly, reciprocity, we argue in this report as well as the other one, meaning what Americans and foreigners in general are allowed, but more particularly not allowed to do in China. Many of the activities that Chinese and other foreigners are allowed to do in this society are increasingly blocked in China. American scholars cannot go about their normal scholarly research. Journalists have always been constricted, increasingly so. NGOs, as Melanie can describe to you after the 2017 NGO law, increasingly squeezed. Many have left the country because they can't operate there. Businesses also experiencing difficulties, and on and on and on. So there is a question about reciprocity, but I think as Susan indicated, we don't really have clear answers on this, because once you, as I think Susan put it, if you go down the Chinese path, it's a race to the bottom. Tit for tat, we have to stay true to our own values, our own open society. And that, at the end of the day, is our greatest strength. So sorry to take so long on two sections of the report, but let's turn now, I guess, to human rights.
No, it was very, very well done, David. Thanks so much to all of you. Now, Ambassador Lane, maybe you would come up and help us.
They need the microphone out there, just for efficiency's sake. Why don't you moderate? Is that okay? Because they've taken this microphone.
Oh, okay. All right, well, Susan.
But I think, well, I actually can do this without a microphone. Just let's say this part. For everybody, please identify, raise your hand and identify yourself and say what your affiliation is or where you're from. And why don't you do your best? And
again, I urge brevity on our questioners. I know it's
Only one
a futile plea, but all right, let's start right here.
Thank you. Robert Delaney, South China Morning Post. At the beginning, we were told that you make policy recommendations to key policymakers. There are varying viewpoints about how the U.S. government should be dealing with China. You have all laid out your arguments. We have, at the same time, we have Senator Marco Rubio giving a press conference about Made in China 2025 and what the response should be. Could you just give us a little bit of clarity on what is your strategy in terms of making recommendations to policymakers. How effective has it been in this environment where there are a lot of different viewpoints about what to do about China? Thank you.
Well, we spent yesterday briefing on the Hill, including to Rubio staff and to Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We're going to the House of Representatives folks today. We have briefed at the White House, the National Security Council, at the State Department. We're going to the National Intelligence Council, and that's about as much as that's about as much as we can squeeze into 2 days in town. Obviously, we also follow up. I mean, all of us write and speak in our own way, so the messages, our recommendations will be transmitted that way as well.
Yeah, and we have two audiences. One is Americans and the American government, and the second is the Chinese government and Chinese. It takes two to do this dance.
Yeah, and also I just want to emphasize, although of course we are communicating, especially in these few days, with decision makers in government, you know, if you look at American public opinion, it's toward China, it's actually quite balanced, and we think important to have a public debate about what is the best way forward to deal with the China challenge in order to preserve American advantages, our own interests, our values.
There's a question right here.
John Pfeffer from The Nation magazine. I was struck when Susan Shirk was talking about how some of the things you mentioned could apply to the Trump administration. I mean, for instance, the flouting of international norms, a more assertive U.S. foreign policy, a zero-sum approach to economics. I'm curious, I'm not interested in your evaluation of that necessarily, but rather, how much have you observed China reacting to that in ways that would reinforce the very trends that you're criticizing? In other words, are we seeing China in the last 2 years specifically react to the Trump administration's approaches in ways that you might find, according to the principles outlined in your report, to be counterproductive?
On the economic side, China's divergence from market-based norms began around 2006, 2007, so predating the current administration. And that was also accompanied by a slowing and then a cessation of reform and opening up. And what you saw in the intervening years when China spoke about reform was to decouple it from opening. So the word reform was simply a solo word, and opening almost entirely dropped out of speechifying in China among the leadership. So these changes predated the Trump administration. The changes accelerated under Xi Jinping, but of course he's been in power over 5 years, Trump 2, so that also predated the Trump administration. I do think that China, of course, imposed tariffs on certain U.S. goods as counter-retaliation for the U.S. imposition of tariffs against China. We would have expected China to do that, and the Trump administration brought that on itself. But I would say, just as a general matter, we can argue about what the Trump administration is or is not doing, or what it stands for or what it does not stand for. But there is no equivalency between the steps and measures China has taken over a number of years, as outlined in all of our remarks and as outlined in our 2017 report and now in our 2019 report, and missteps the United States may have made or may be making. There is simply no equivalency.
Right here. And then we'll take you with the woman with the scarf.
So I'm Bethany Allen Abrahamian, and I am a journalist. I have kind of an either-or interpretation of some of these larger trends that we're seeing across numerous fields. And I'd be curious, which one you would agree with, or feel free to kind of deconstruct this rather artificial dichotomy.
Could you speak a little louder?
Sure. So the U.S., this is an either-or statement, and I'm curious how you would respond to it. The U.S. and its allies have awoken very late to China's multi-pronged push for global sway, and our attempts to uphold a rules-based liberal order and our own interests aren't keeping up with Chinese attempts to undermine them. So that's one interpretation, right? So here's a different one. China has overreached, and its blatant attention to coerce other countries economically, diplomatically, and militarily has backfired, leading to a major backlash. These are kind of opposite interpretations. I'm curious which one you think is more accurate, or feel free to just totally deconstruct that if you think that's rather artificial.
Might I try that one, and then maybe with couples we'll try. I would say that that you can't really fully understand China without a deep appreciation of contradiction, and I think both of those statements are true.
Yeah. Same. And it's important to recognize that if the economic piece started, as Charlene says, quite some time ago, the global values piece is really much newer. A lot of the policies are, the overseas internet infrastructure building, the norms, the big push on human rights. A lot of that is more recent, and to me, it makes sense to give China the benefit of the doubt a little bit, but now there's enough of an empirical record that it is very clear that a big pushback needs to happen. And that is why you're starting to see people wake up. You're starting to see a backlash. I have been going over to Europe to compare notes with Europeans. I noticed a shocking change just in the past year in terms of people understanding. Once you see Belt and Road sounded great, but then once you saw the projects built, it was a different matter.
Anyone else? Okay. Right here, this gentleman. And then.
Yes, Robert Keatley, a mostly retired journalist. I've only skimmed the report, but it doesn't seem to mention Russia, which has increased closer relations with China. To what degree, if any, does that complicate our dealings with China on things like security, global governments, human rights, and so forth?
Well, the report, you're quite right, Robert. It's mentioned not very much, once or twice. It is mentioned in the influence section to try and distinguish China from Russian activities. Mentioned maybe once or twice elsewhere, but I think it should have been emphasized more, and I would refer you to a recent report by the National Bureau of Asian Research, NBR, which undertook a year-long project on China-Russia relations and has put out a very in-depth and engaged, first of all, about 75 experts. Same sort of exercise as this. Took a year, has a book and several other smaller products. But my colleague at George Washington, Robert Sutter, was the lead on that. But the basic argument that their conclusion they came to is that it is an underappreciated element and problem for the United States, the China-Russia axis, I think, may even not be too strong of a word. The coordination between China and Russia on a whole range of issues that are inimical to, some of them, in contradiction to, and inconsistent with American policies and values and priorities. So this is a subject that deserves more attention in this city and in the expert community. We didn't get into it that much, I don't think, in our report, but the NBR report is superb, and I would commend that to you.
If I could just embroider that a little, I do think that what's worrisome about the Russia-China relationship is that it's not an ideological relationship, but it's a relationship that's bonded together over a common grievance of sort of an empire dispossessed or denied. And so there's a kind of a sense in both cases that they are being beset upon by the liberal Western developed world. And I think it's a very powerful bond, but it's not a very, it probably won't be very durable.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning, Scott Tong, Marketplace Public Radio. A question for Professor Shirk. You dissented publicly in a previous report from the Hoover Institution on the Chinese influence activities in the U.S. And I looked at that briefly a moment ago, and you were concerned about kind of blurring, conflating of legitimate and illegitimate activities, and you were concerned about overstating. And I wonder, now that you spent a day or two in the policymaking apparatus here in Washington, are your concerns, have they been affirmed, validated, or no?
Well, that dissent was on the influence activities report, and as David said, I'm totally comfortable with the section in our report on that subject, which makes a very clearly distinguishes, as David just said, between the sort of legitimate public diplomacy efforts and what David has very usefully called interference, which is more coercive and more insidious, and it definitely has an impact on our civil society organizations, including universities. However, I was also concerned that that especially that report, which conflated the two, and it was kind of a scoping study. You know, people were doing research on so many different domains, and it was 200 pages long. And the way they talked about it, I didn't entirely agree with. And so I felt I had to dissent, and the authors of the report very kindly offered me that opportunity. And one of the things that I said there was that I feel we really need to right-size this perceived China threat and not inflate it, because if we do inflate it, I lack confidence in our own reactions. American body politic has a tendency to overreact to external threats, especially of something that looks like subversion. And I feel that risk at this present moment under the Trump administration is actually a greater risk to the United States than what the Chinese are trying to do. Not that I am not also concerned about what the Chinese are trying to do. So that's why I said that. I really am particularly concerned about putting all ethnic Chinese under a cloud of suspicion. And I think everybody else is concerned about that too. As to after being in Washington, yeah, I'm actually more concerned, because I feel that there is a political tsunami in Washington against the China threat, not just against the influence issues, but across the board, in every domain, every continent, and certainly on the Hill, the fact that this is a point of bipartisan agreement when there are so few others, and the counter-espionage effort is really picked up tremendous steam, and we know that there is a real problem of theft of intellectual property and espionage activities. And the Chinese government uses non-officials in this way, but there's a tremendous risk of going around trying to get everybody really scared about this, that will have create this great suspicion of all people from China and all ethnic Chinese. And you saw what Senator Burr said the other day about, he said you can't distinguish between Chinese students who come to American universities to steal technology from those who are here for legitimate education. So therefore, we just have to cut visas. And, I mean, fortunately, we haven't done that yet, but spending time in Washington makes me more worried that we're headed in that direction. So that's why I say we just need to calm down, not panic, catch our breaths, and let's dispassionately think of how to handle these issues very cautiously. Because if we go overboard, you know, we've seen it before. So we know the kind of emotional, violent emotion that fear of threat, especially an ideological threat as well as a security threat, how we may overreact. That doesn't mean we don't need to react. We need to do what we need to do to protect our national security. But I don't see anybody really pausing to think long and hard about the potential costs of some of the export controls and other things, which will really affect whether or not Chinese students can be in our laboratories on American campuses.
I should say, as a co-chair of that report, I'm glad Susan dissented, because I think this is a real problem that needs to be discussed. But there is a problem. And I think you have to be very careful to divide it into two sections. First of all, what is the problem of Chinese interference? And describe it. That's section one. And we have an obligation to do that, to defend our own society and our own principles. Section two is, what are you going to do about it? And what are the consequences of doing something about it? I don't want to be prevented from understanding the problem, announcing the problem, studying the problem, because I fear that America may be too incompetent to deal with it. I recognize American incompetence, and I fear it. But, so that's the way I think those of us who forged on, but I think Susan's dissent has certainly gotten everybody's attention. Nothing wrong with that.
And,
Okay.
you know, Orville and Larry Diamond were the ones who suggested I do it. So the whole thing was very collegial and a lot of mutual respect. And, you know, that's great about the way we do things here.
All right, let's see, here, and then we'll go to the back.
Thank you for doing this. My name is Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And my question is for Professor Shirk and Professor Schoenberg. David, you mentioned that the Trump administration seems to be pushing envelope on Taiwan issue. A couple days ago, several senators suggest that the House Speaker should invite President Tsai to make a speech in a Congress, to the Congress. So what's your takes on that? And also, Professor Shirk, you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State in 1997, right? It just, you know, the U.S. China relations just recovered from the Li Donghui's visit to Cornell. So what's your takes on this issue? Thank you.
Well, we know what happened last time. Susan was there in the fire at the time, but it's totally inconsistent with the Normalization Accords of 1979, the One China Policy, and the Taiwan Relations Act. Sitting Taiwanese presidents do not get visas to come to the United States while they're in office, full stop.
And, you know, I always feel that we should concentrate on ways that will make the people of Taiwan actually better off. More secure, more prosperous, have more opportunities to participate in international organizations. These symbolic actions which will, of course, be viewed as highly provocative and destabilizing, not just to the leadership in China, but to the public in China. You know, to me, it's a bad idea.
Okay, gentleman right back here.
Thank you. My name is Jong No from Radio Free Asia. On North Korea issue, as you know that the second summit will take place soon in Vietnam. But for denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, the China always played a very important role, but different interest in the approach between U.S. and China toward the Korean Peninsula issue. So, what do you recommend, or what do you think the is to cooperate between China and United States for denuclearization, and how the United States can press on China for the denuclearization?
Who would like to try that?
Well, I can say something. You know, I'm really not very up to date on the current state of China-U.S. consultations and on North Korea. I certainly don't think they're pulling in opposite directions. And it has always been an area in which there's a lot of overlap of interests, actually, between the United States and China. It's been an area, it's been kind of a bright light of cooperation. And so I think despite all the other frictions in the relationship, I still think we're moving in a common direction with Beijing on North Korea.
Okay, right here, and then maybe we have time for one more after that.
Thank you. Joe Bosco, formerly with the Defense Department. Ms. Barshevsky made an interesting point that under the WTO regime, China has violated so many of its obligations that it in effect has nullified its right to the benefits of WTO. In other words, it's a mutual arrangement, and if one party violates it, the other party is relieved of its obligations. I'm wondering why that doesn't apply, David, to the question of TRA and the original Shanghai Communique. The understanding of the U.S. was that any change in Taiwan's status would be done peacefully. China has made it clear from day one that it rejects that condition, that it will use force if it decides it needs to use force. So why are we not free to change some of the modus operandi of the original agreement in terms of relations with Taiwan?
I believe in keeping one's commitments, first of all. That's called credibility, and major powers need to maintain their credibility. Secondly, Joe, if you read the 1979 as well as the 82 joint communiques, China pledged itself in both to the peaceful resolution, I think the language is, of the issue. Thirdly, if any side has broken those communiques, it's been the United States through its escalated arms sales to Taiwan over time. We've otherwise maintained our consistency with the one China policy, I would say, over a really very long period of time, many administrations, and that's rather remarkable. But I don't share what you insinuate about the need to, and there are other advocates, obviously, in this city who would like to change America's relationship with Taiwan, invite Tsai Ing-wen to address the Congress, do all kinds of, send American cabinet officials, send American destroyers into Kaohsiung, send American Marines into AIT on Taiwan. I don't support any of that because it's very inconsistent with the commitments we made in 1979.
Okay, we have time for one more question here.
Thank you. My name is Ali Wine. I'm a policy analyst for the RAND Corporation. I wanted to pick up on Bethany's a question from a few minutes ago about sort of competing or contradictory ways of assessing China's resurgence, which I think is a really important point. And to amplify the question, you've chronicled in this presentation, in the report, the many ways in which China's power is growing militarily, economically, politically, but to what end? And in other words, when you engage with your Chinese counterparts, and they use phrases like the China dream, the great rejuvenation of the China nation. What do you think they mean operationally? Where does China, with its growing power across dimensions, where does it see itself in the world in decades to come?
Maybe I'll have a crack at that first. I do think, I mean, this is a very uncertain territory because we are not futurists. But I do think that what we see if we look back is China, as it increases the scope of its pretensions globally in almost every realm and expands outward, it also, I think, has begun to elaborate a picture in which it's seeking to protect its interests, as it describes it, in a more global way. And that's both militarily, it's both culturally, it's both propaganda, media. But I think also, you know, there is buried within this pretension some notion that began to come of age in 2008 and 2009 during the financial crisis, that maybe China does have a better model, a better way of doing things. And I think its efforts to expand abroad are sort of calculated to protect itself at home, because the world is no longer one in which China can move into autarky. So it sees its own national interest as begging a kind of more broader and global protection. And thus you have the Belt and Road, thus you have a myriad other ways in which it's projecting its power.
I mean, my view is that this kind of global ambition for China is inevitable. You know, it is, and totally understandable. It's a very big country that had an empire. It's a big historical player on the world stage. And, you know, as China now recovers its economic capabilities, you know, it's bound to want to aspire to leadership and influence beyond Asia. And that I guess I see the goal as very inchoate. I don't think it's well defined. And therefore, because part of it is international respect, status, respect as a responsible power. I mean, I think this is a big difference between China and Russia. You know, Chinese leaders really want to be respected as representatives of a country that does provide global public goods. You know, that rhetoric isn't just tactical. I mean, it is tactical, and they want people to believe it, and that'll be nice, and they don't always behave that way, for sure. But I think it's also aspirational. So I think that's something one can build on. And, you know, if we and our friends and allies are real clear about how you earn status in the world, you know, I think we can sort of help direct China's ambitions in a more constructive direction. And actually, our report has a number of ideas about engaging China in that kind of way on issues like refugees and things like that. So, but I'm not naive. I know that they're aiming at a lot of military bases around the world too. So you have to think about that. Is it really a big threat to us when China has a military base? I don't know. You know, I mean, obviously we'd like them to be a big civilian power with, you know, doing all peaceful, nice things and not military development. So, you know, I think we still have leverage, influence, and other countries do too. So that's another thing that is really important, I think. Sometimes in America, we think it all depends on us. But as we see from the reactions of other countries to some of these Belt and Road projects and other types of initiatives that are really forms of intervention, you're getting pushback from these countries. So I have a little more confidence that the natural dynamic will be to signal to China about what's costly and what's beneficial to its ambitions. And I haven't myself lost all confidence in the pragmatism of China's leaders. But again, I believe this needs to be tested. And if we get more information, that it's, there's really no hope of moderating those ambitions and putting them in a constructive direction, we have plenty of time to deal with that.
Well, listen, I think we have to come to an end, alas. I want to thank the Sunnylands Annenberg Trust and Jeff Phillips and Ambassador David Lane for being our partners, and thanks all of you for coming and my colleagues for holding forth. Thank you.